Hello and welcome to our webinar, Identity, Innovation, Impact, How to Create a Better Future in the Context of a Profound Crisis. My name is Laurence Schwer from ESCP Business School Berlin campus. I will be your moderator today. As some may already know, today's webinar is part of a series of webinars created by ESCP Business School and that we call Beyond COVID-19 Inspiration for Change. In the context of the current crisis, ESCP has mobilized experts and professors from 5 of its European campuses to develop this series. Our aim is to support you as managers and companies in this exceptional situation. I mean, today more than ever, in the light of the current crisis, employees need a holding environment from their companies. At the same time, customers value companies that are innovative. Identity is the key to creating hold and orientation and to delivering better and more impactful strategies, products, and experiences. So today in this webinar, you will learn how to leverage the power of identity in order to accelerate innovation and how to create a sustainable future for your organization. I'm very happy to have Marc Sasserat as our speaker today. Thanks for joining us, Marc.
Thank you, Laurence.
So just quickly to introduce you, so Marc Sasserat is affiliate professor for innovation and entrepreneurship at ESCP with a focus on entrepreneurial branding and cultural transformation. He's lecturing at ESCP in Paris and in Berlin. Marc is also founder and CEO of Sasserat Plus Group. It's a group of identity-driven growth consultancies like Sasserat Munzinger Plus, which is a brand culture and innovation consultancy, SK Plus Sasserat Kienbein Plus, a culture of innovation firm, and Sasserat Mutabor, which brings together strategy and design. So before we get started, just a very quick overview of today's house rules. Feel free to ask questions during the entire presentation in the questions fields. And at the end of the presentation, which will last around 30-35 minutes, there will be 20 minutes to cover those questions. Also, the webinar is recorded and will be made available online on ESCP homepage. So now I pass on to our speaker. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurence. Hello and good afternoon. I'm very happy to share a couple of thoughts with you today because I think in the light of the current context and the light of COVID-19, I think, the world has changed dramatically. Although, some of the context that we already saw has still quite some impact. So let's start with the world we live in and welcome to our world, because basically, if you look at our context today, I think it's very much driven, as we all know, by tech, by digital, and the impact that is created through tech is tremendous. I just took this picture from India because the way how digital is changing the world in India is something which, some of my friends called how it's decasting the country. So it's basically have an impact on the culture. So it's not only about business, it's not only about, the way how we interact, how we communicate, but it's very much, how a whole society functions. It's creating so much impact in terms of, you see, Africa and how much education is brought to even remote landscapes which were not connected to, courses of ESCP, like this free webinar or, other educational institutions. And basically it was somehow kind of disconnected, but it's also showing us that, of course, the world of business is changing dramatically through everything that we can connect or how we can experience technology. I think one of the easy examples that we all know is how kids interact with technology. My older kids are still swipers, so the way how they interact is swiping. But if you look at young kids, their way of communicating is much more natural or much more organic, if you like, because they just speak. So voice is becoming the interface of the future, and this is something that's really interesting if you think about communications, about branding, about identity, because how do brands, how do countries, how do organizations really speak? You know, are they male, are they female? You know, what's their tone of voice? So that's kind of interesting. And of course, the superpower of today is artificial intelligence. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to the thinking of Harari. I happened to be at the ORM Congress in 2018, where he was speaking and he was sharing his thoughts, and he was speaking about the ability to hack humans, which is basically based on, you know, that we do have more behavioral knowledge, we have more computing power, we have more data available, and this is getting into a situation, or helping us to get into a situation, where basically we can understand humans much better than we were used to. If you look at this illustration, and this was just a photo that I took during his session, where he somehow anecdotal pointed out that it took himself 20 years to figure out that he was gay, and now artificial intelligence can do that in, you know, seconds, or even less than seconds. And the idea and the understanding is, and you can see this in the right hand corner in the picture, is if you look at, you know, how our eyes go through the picture, if we look at one of the two genders, then what happens if we look at a certain part of the you know, the exposed body, then of course the computing power is so strong that it will now immediately identify, you know, which kind of character I am, you know, what kind of person I am, but also what my sexual orientation is and what pleases me. So I think this is something which is changing the world dramatically. And if you look at, you know, how AI is already used in interface from airlines like KLM, this is dramatically changing the world, how we communicate, but it's also changing the world, how we create, you know, human life and human understanding. And if you think about, you know, the DNA skizzes, which were used in China something like 2 years ago for the first time, where we basically have the ability to modify the genetic code, I think this is something which is really changing humanity and humankind much more than we ever experienced that before. And this comes at a point in time where the world is in turmoil. I think we all remember, you know, sometimes it's still happening, you know, the dramatic fires that took place in Australia. We do experience, you know, a lot of strange things happening with our environment, and I think the impact will only be visible in a number of years, but this is something which is, you know, to a very high extent irreversible, and this will change the way dramatically how we will live in the future. Society is also infected. This is a picture which was taken at the recent row which went on in Hong Kong. Stuttgart, which might be one of the most boring places in Germany, was shaken over, you know, social unrest over the course of the last weekend. And also, if you look at the last elections in one of the federal states of Germany, which is Thuringia, the result was that most votes were given to two parties which were representing the extremes. So the left-wing party, which was the former party of the Social Democratic Republic, as well as the fascists, the AfD, they united most of the voters, and basically, you know, this is something which we never experienced before in you know, in Germany. At least we saw it in some other European countries. But I think this is tremendously creating impact on our world and the way we live in. And then suddenly, out of China, the virus was coming, and we now even fight for our lives. And I think, you know, the impact is created by COVID is not only something which is, you know, pandemic, so that it's harming our lives, it's harming our society, but the effect of lockdowns, the effect of locking down the economy, and, you know, just getting businesses out of business for a longer period of time will create much more unrest and more problems. So what we see is we live in a very dysfunctional world. You know, the world has lost some of its beauty, you know, some is still there, of course, but, you know, some of the functions that we used to have are becoming more and more unimportant, and they will be harmed. But the problem that we also see is that organizations are becoming dysfunctional to a very high degree, and some organizations even tend to be sick. I don't know how many of you remember, and this is a very nice caricature which basically describes the situation which took place at France Telecom a number of years ago, and which is now the subject of a court case in France. And basically, the situation was that the board at France Telecom decided in good financial shape. So actually, and this was, and there are also files that prove that this was true, the board decided that they want to make it much easier for people to take a free decision to leave the company. The measures were so harsh and so, so inhuman that some people not only left the companies, but basically they committed suicide. And they not only committed suicide, but they also left messages which talked about the situation, that basically the situation at France Telecom was so unbearable that they couldn't stand it anymore and they couldn't stay in their lives. This was now found out. This was also, I think there were lots of rumors. Basically, the pressure on the French president was raised. The French president basically decided to sack the CEO of the company. And France Telecom today is no longer called France Telecom, but it's called Orange, because they had to withdraw the name because it was so bloody, if you like. So basically, I think this is one of the best proofs that companies are becoming more and more dysfunctional, and they can't cope with reality. Some of them just disappear, and BCG just did some recent research, and they said one of the results of such failures can just be in BCG's research. They found that just over 50% of the Fortune 500 companies from 2000 had gone bankrupt, had been bought or had shut down by 2017. So basically, again, and an earlier report from Accenture basically proved the same. Companies just keep disappearing. We know the impact of the financial crisis in 2018, but basically, it's becoming stronger and stronger. And this is the impact of all the external stuff which is going on. But this is also the impact of that there's too much pressure from the inside. So people or companies and organizations can't cope with the variation in and the uncertainty which is created by the external world. But at the same time, they also say that they can't cope with what they need to do internally. So if you think about, the debate between holacracy and dictatorship within companies, so everything which is related to leadership, this is something which is creating a tremendous amount of pressure. Also, how do we integrate customer centricity is, a big row, and is causing so much trouble within companies because they don't really know what to do. And there are lots of other areas like innovation, like entrepreneurship. How do we integrate this? If you're a asset company, that basically companies just understand that they need to change, but the amount of change which they have to take into consideration is just creating a lot of paralyzation, and they don't really know what to do. But it's all about transformation, and transformation, is the name of the game. Transformation is what's happening today. And we just did some research last year where we tried to understand, how many companies are truly in transformation. And we took, a very uncommon approach. We just asked employees, so we had a population representative sample, and we found out that 83% of German employees consider their company being exposed to some kind of transformation. So, if we take this as some kind of indication that it might be true that 4 out of 5 companies are undergoing some kind of change process currently, which I think is absolutely the case, we have a lot to do. The problem is, and most of us know that, and there is a lot of research published, and I just want to quote Ron Ashkenazi here, that 70% of all transformation efforts fail. So basically, people or companies know that they have to change. They start some kind of process, but they never achieve their goals. And why is that? It's because of us. It's because of humans. It's because of the culture. Because among those who fail, 58% consider culture as a major hurdle within the process. So it's basically about the way how we interact. It's about the way how values, how culture have an impact on everything that's happening. And I think this is something that we have to take into consideration when we get into any kind of transformational process, because otherwise we will just fail. Just to quote Darwin here, according to Darwin's Origin of Species, it's not the most intellectual species that survives, it's not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And I think this is something that we definitely have to take into consideration. And what we do, or what we try to understand, is what are the factors that have the strongest impact or the strongest influence on a successful transformation. And we could identify 5 different factors. One is purpose and motivation. So people need to understand what's their purpose, or why should they change? What's the inner energy that is, pushing any kind of transformation. So that's one thing. Secondly, and I come back to this later at the third part of this presentation or this lecture, is about innovation culture. How do we create a culture of creativeness? How do we create a culture which is very open, which is learning friendly, and this is also open into experimenting with new ideas. Third dimension is positive work environment. Fourth dimension is leadership competencies, and the fifth is about principles and values. And this is where we integrate a very strange concept, which is the concept of brand. Because brand for us serves as a proxy or as a projection for a space which at one point in time gives us hold. So it's basically, it tells us where we stand, but it also gives us orientation in where we want to move. So it's basically, something which is creating stability, but it's also creating momentum, because we know both where we stand, but also where we want to be heading. This is a very interesting concept that we use to integrate into this kind of thinking, which is the boundary object. And the boundary object, and this is how we explain brand within transformation, it's like a 3-dimensional space, which tells me exactly where in this 3-dimensional space I am as an organization. But it also tells me, which is the angle that I want to move to. But it also tells me, what's the area that I can't reach and that I shouldn't reach. So it's also telling me, where are my boundaries. So again, this helps me to create this understanding of identity, which then can create impact on strategy, culture, and processes. So the brand can act as a guiding concept, and it's also tangible for people. So that's very interesting, because in all kinds, and I relate to this in a minute, in all kinds of processes, it's very much about understanding, how people understand the concept of their own identity. And brand, as we found out, is something which is very easy applicable, because everyone understands what a brand could be, it should be, and especially at this corporate level, it's a very nice proxy. The key questions that we ask if we talk about identity is basically, who am I? What am I good at? So, what am I good at delivering? How am I as a person? This is basically about my character and about my personality. What gives me Gestalt? So if you think about the Queen, or if you think about Karl Lagerfeld, or if you think about Macron or Merkel, when you close your eyes, you have something on your mind. You have, like gestures, clothes, in terms of, if you think about Karl Lagerfeld, you had his style, you have the black glasses, everything which is connected to him. And I think these are powerful weapons, powerful tools if you think about organizations, because this is something that people recognize it for and how they connect. And then where do I come from and where do I want to go? So it's all about the legacy, the history, but also, the future and my ambition. This is something that we translate into a very simplistic model. We call it the brand identity model. And the brand identity model basically talks about, in 3 dimensions, about, your capabilities. So what am I good at? And this defines is, which kind of market am I on? What are my strengths? And then we talk, because this is a very realistic process where it all comes together, about the personality. How am I as a person? Am I rather dominant? Am I empathetic? Am I nice? So what are my traits that all go together? And then within this outer circle, because this is the connection to all different stakeholder groups, it's about manifestation. So this is about what brings me Gestalt. And if I then think about the, the epicenter of the brand, which we call the brand idea, this is how we can focus all our thinking into one central thought. And if you think about BMW, for instance, Freude am Fahren, or the joy of driving, or the concept of joy, drives everything. It drives how they develop cars, it drives the acquisition strategy, it drives how they create stands at Frankfurt Motor Show, and how they develop this whole thing. So this is the concept or the construct that we use. And if you integrate this into this kind of transformational process, we use this within the initialization as a tool for analysis. So we ask people, how do you feel about this brand as the proxy to make them understand what you say? Then it's about developing the guiding star and the framework. So this is about our transformational idea, but this is also about creating the sense of urgency, because nobody's changing if they don't feel that they need to change. So sense of urgency is one of the key ingredients for successful transformation. And this should be resolved, or this should be moved into the future by this central idea. Then we talk about mobilization, and this is something that we integrate into storytelling, into a nice narrative, because this is what people believe in. People follow people, but what they talk about are stories. So we integrate the sense of urgency and the transformation idea into some kind of transformation narrative. This is how we start the whole movement and how we mobilize people. And then it's getting into implementation, where we basically try to employ a very simplistic model where we try to understand if this is how we define our future. Where do we see barriers? What is already good? And what are future ideas that we can create this new normal within our organization? And then it's basically about this whole anchoring, where we create this new reality and everybody can experience it. And I think this is something which is also important, and just to quote Simon Sinek, who is not only famous for the golden circle, but it's also interesting because we want people to play a pivotal role within creating their new, their new future. And he said, welcome to the adventure playground. When people are financially invested, they want to return. When people are emotionally invested, they want to contribute. So it's basically about creating something that people feel well with and where they want to build this new structure. And this is what we use. But how about innovation? So this is about, we understand now identity. We understand how identity and brand can help as concepts in creating transformation. But transformation is also about innovation. And what we also see is that, and we also did some research on this, in the last couple of weeks, that people really appreciate and value companies that create innovation, especially in the context of COVID. So 80% of all Germans declare that companies that behave in a very innovative manner during the crisis, they will follow, they will support, and they create some kind of a sustainable relationship with. Innovation is interesting because there are lots of ways to think about innovation, but innovation, and this is very clear, has a tremendous impact on company growth. And this was just a comparison which was done by Accenture this year, is that companies that are more innovative have a much higher category growth than most other companies that do not value innovation to such a high extent. The problem is, especially if you look at Germany, that the majority of German small and medium-sized businesses, so most of the SMEs have no innovation strategy, and they therefore fail to grow, which is kind of the problem. And even worse, small and medium-sized enterprises are increasingly withdrawing from the innovation battle. So they tend to innovate much less than they did in the past. So less resources, less budget, less people involved. And this, of course, is leading to a decline of strengths, which the industry usually used to happen, especially the Mittelstand, or what we call Mittelstand in Germany, used to be very innovative, but they just lost it. The question is, and I think the reason for this negative experience with innovation, or negative experience with innovation is one of the, is one of the reasons why basically, they do not achieve what they want to achieve. But it's also due to a lack of strategy. It's very, very interesting how companies can then change, not only the culture, but also the strategy in terms of innovation and what they need to do for the future. So innovation therefore requires a shared understanding, a clear strategy, and a comprehensive implementation across the organization in order to be successful in a very sustainable way, but also in the long term. And where it's growing is basically at the interface between people, so your key resource, technology, which is all about feasibility, and business, where it's all about the market and the viability. And innovation is really created at the focal point where all of these three circles basically merge and mingle. It also encompasses the various facets of the company. So it's, if you talk about the internal point of view, it's all about process and technology, which is involved in innovation processes, but it's also integrating organization and culture. So when we want to be creative, we have to redesign the internal organization, and we also have to change the work culture. So everything that we talk about now in the context of new work is basically trying to enable companies to be more creative and to be more innovative and to be more people-centric and humanistic and understanding. But it's also about the external factors, which are product and market. So what are the kind of products, which could also be services, do we need to develop in terms of, how can we create something which develops a new benefit, but also in terms of market. So, what's interesting in terms of the different target groups, but also sales regions, business models, markets. So how can we make money in the long term? But it also works on the three different horizons, both in terms of time and complexity. And I think this is something that you should all be aware of, which is the three horizon model by McKinsey. And basically what they say, horizon one is very much, short term. So it's about, an outlook of something like a maximum 2 years. And this is about optimizing the existing business model. The second horizon is about an evolution. So it's about, products or services which are somehow connected. It's not the same market, but it's the next phase of evolution. The third horizon, which is far above 3 years, it's everything that we could call disruption or, drastic renewal. And what they say is that 70% of all efforts and resources should be put behind optimization, 20% within evolution, and 10% into disruption and renewal. And this should all happen at the same time to be really future-proof, which is interesting because these are, of course, also different speeds. It's also interesting because it's top-down and bottom-up at the same time. It's also a way where companies struggle with how do we actually organize in terms of, do we fund some kind of accelerator? How do we set it up? And I think, where it's also interestingly reflected is this kind of thinking, which was the foundation for Zone to Win, which is basically, organizing to compete in the age of disruption by Geoffrey Moore, where he was basically talking about these two-dimensional model where we have these 4 different quadrants, where we see this kind of, he basically said we have 2 different kind of financial measures. One is revenue performance and one is enabling investments, and then we have disruptive innovation and sustaining innovation. So if we talk about revenue performance and disruptive innovation, about the transformation zone. So this is really about creating the future. If we talk about sustaining innovation and revenue performance, this is like the performance zone. This is where we make money. If we talk about enabling the investments and disruptive innovation, this is the incubation zone. So this is also something that could happen within an accelerator. And sustaining innovation and enabling investments is the productivity zone, where we can basically increase productivity and therefore make money in the long run. So, which is a very sustainable approach. And I think this is like a very interesting mindset if we look at the organizations, because we see that we also have different skills, but also different people, but also different cultural traits within one organization that are treating the different parents. If you look at our approach, we have a systematic and holistic understanding of innovation, because we think that innovation affects the entire organization, from leadership and culture to strategy and process and structures and systems. So it's basically, everything is connected, and it doesn't really matter whether we talk about products, schools, society, organization, methods, or even services, because innovation is everything which delivers some kind of new benefit or some kind of new. Our foundation, which we lay for innovation, is again through identity, because we strongly believe that innovation and identity are interdependent. But unconsciously or consciously in control, identity determines the direction and scale of innovation. So that's very clear, because where it comes from and what you want to achieve in the future is very much, like, even if you take humans, it's like a coherent development. There can be some kind of bifurcation points, but still, it's somehow like a coherent development. Innovation renews and alters identity, stabilizes. By cross-pollination, these apparent opposites create potential that can be unleashed. And I think this is, this is basically how it's all being stimulated by understanding the identity, but also understanding what the market wants, and then creating this kind of information. And those who understand identity as an integral part of innovation can activate, steer, and fully tap into the innovation potential of companies. So that's the foundation. The brand again comes into the equation and is the embodiment of identity and strategic control instrument. The brand helps us to people be aware of the organizational identity and to analyze and develop it strategically. So it lays the foundation in terms of what we want to develop. And then from there, we can basically serve as a source of inspiration, as a filter, as some kind of guiding stars, and then also help us implement, what we will create in the future and how, as a company, we can become very innovative. So we think, and I think this is like encapsulating it all, that innovation is identity based, because we strongly believe that successful innovation connects heritage and future, because it's building a connection of the different spheres. And this is also where, again, we would use this kind of model and where we have this kind of innovation filter using the brand identity platform to see how we can really create a better future. And just to bring some flesh to the bone, or use this as some kind of illustration, I would love to speak about one case which I think is kind of interesting in terms of how even one of the SME companies in Germany has developed and has transformed into possibly not yet an innovative powerhouse or innovation powerhouse, but they, I think, are on the right track, which is Bahlsene. Bahlsene is a very old company. It's now there for something like 130 years. It was launched in 1889 as a cookie producer. And if you look at it, it's very clear in terms of what the values are and how the company evolved over time. 4 generations ago, the company was launched by a guy who was called Hermann Bahlsene. He found cookies in the UK, brought them to Germany, created a new word, which is cakes, because he translated cake into German, which didn't sound well. So he created this new kind of word. And over the course of time, the company developed into something relatively big and powerful. The problem is today, they somehow got disconnected to the heritage, but they also are faced with the market, i.e. food, which is changing dramatically because people are changing the way they eat, they're changing their eating habits. And of course, cookies are sugar-based, or were traditionally sugar-based, so it had to change quite a lot. So what they came up with, and I think this is a very nice illustration of how much sense it makes to really understand, where you're coming from and what you want to achieve, is that they created, and somehow hidden in here, is they created this overarching idea, what Bahlsene stands for, which is creating and crafting good since 1889. Creating and crafting good since 1889, of course, has a special application to food. So it's more about creating and crafting good food since 1889, but it tells you exactly what we need to do. It tells you exactly what we need to sell today on Horizon 1. It tells you where we need to invest, but it also tells us where we need to innovate and disrupt with interesting stuff. Create means there's always a creative energy. It's always about innovation. It's always about new ideas that come into the equation. It's not about something which was already there. Crafting means being on the pursuit of constant perfection, producing products that are always better. So it's always about, improving stuff and getting better. And good basically means it tastes good because it's food. It does good. So it's something which is good for me. So we have to reduce sugar, we have to think about gluten, we have to think about new ingredients, we have to think about functional food. But good also means good for the planet, which also has a tremendous impact on everything which is produced in terms of packaging, but also everything which is, integrating the whole delivery about logistics. So what can we do in terms of delivering this? And then we came up, and this is basically, being illustrated here and how it was structured. So Bahlsene has some kind of core business, which is still cookies, which is where they're coming from, but they created very nicely a bridge into the future. The most advanced is the innovation center, which is called Herman's after the founder. So Herman's is about, the future or the good future of food. It's something about, ideas that will take place or will become real in 10 years' time. Then they acquired new companies like Rawbite. Rawbite is not what they produce traditionally, but it's something which is in terms of philosophy, in terms of values, very close to them. And they integrated this company, which was a grown-up startup, if you like. So they already made some money, and they now scale. And between acquisition, that will be called Ted Ventures in the future, and the innovation hub, Herman's, they integrated an accelerator which is called Kitchen Town. So they invested into Kitchen Town in Palo Alto, in Silicon Valley, which is a traditional accelerator for food. And they also brought to Berlin. And this is where they now call it the home for food and tech startups. But basically, they bring together, food innovation and tech innovation, which has a very high overlap today. And from there, they start to make creating and crafting good their future story, their future narrative, and bring it to life. And I think this is when I was talking about identity, innovation, and impact, a story which serves us as a very good example, and where we want to help more organizations to think about this in a good way, to understand where they were coming from, understanding their identity, and then translating this into innovation to create a better future. So that's it from me. I think it took me something like 37 minutes, but I'm very happy to discuss. So let's get into a debate.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation. So yeah, now it's time for questions from the audience, and so feel free to ask them in the chat. And we already have a few questions that came up during your presentation. So first, Nadine is asking more about innovation. How is innovation measured? And also, are there specific KPIs to state the innovation level of a company?
That's interesting. I think innovation is, I think innovation should be measured from a perspective. Of course, there are lots of measures where you can say which can serve as intermediate measures. But I think innovation is something where the beauty lies in the person's eye who looks at it. So basically, people who are customers, people who consume. So all of us humans, we can easily tell you, what's innovative or not, because if a product or service is creating some new benefit. And I think that's the key dimension that we have to understand. It's basically, great. I think like the iPhone was no true innovation, but it just makes it more user-friendly in terms of interface, how we could work with, mobile data. So for me, the iPhone was some kind of innovation, although it was not totally new as a concept. So technically, or technology-based, it was not something new, but I think the way how people interacted with it was the same. So I think, changing perspective and seeing it from a customer perspective is the key ingredient. I think, there are lots of intermediate measures, some is the degree of patents that are, registered by companies, also the amount of money and research which goes into, or resources which goes into innovation and creating new stuff. But we can also see, like soft values, where we see, like how do people or how do organizations create a culture which is play friendly? How do they create a culture which is reducing the extent of anxiety? There's this famous quote by Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook, who said, "What would you do if you were not afraid?" And I think this is a very good measurement of how innovative a company could be, because if we decrease the degree of anxiety, I think this will help us to be much more innovative. So these are basically, lots of intermediate measures, but I think the key is really understanding the world through the eyes of people who use stuff, who produce, how they interact with, products and services, and see whether this creates some kind of new benefit for them.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that does answer the question. We have another question here from Laura, referring to the Bahlsene example on how identity can drive and inform innovation. What actually was the impact, and how do you measure it, again, and talking a lot about measurement in this specific case, and which dimensions of impact are relevant in that case?
Well, I think, the impact that we can measure with Hermans is not there yet, because this is about, being trouble-based and understanding innovation from a very early point in time. We now see first, the first product which are integrated into the core assortment of Bahlsene, but this is, this is not something that we can fully understand. I think in terms of acquisition, we can see whether they scale or not. So, so additional revenue, we'll see whether we create, whether we invest into a company which is innovative and therefore has a growth path. I think within the accelerator, it's very, there's a very easy measurement, which is just the rate of success. How many of the companies that you invested in and are part of an accelerator batch do survive, and how much do they scale, and what's the value that they make. So I think this is a very clear financial measure. And at the, at the very end, financial measures have to be part of that to see how it's all integrated. So I think the impact of this whole system is basically that based on where they're coming from, they are now able to see where they should invest. They have a very clear, structured, sequential approach, how innovation can be brought into the whole organization. And they basically, they expand their territory. So that's the impact which was created by innovation, or by identity-based innovation for a company like Bahlsene.
Thank you, Mark. So we have another couple of questions. One from Frédéric, asking, don't you think that there is a risk that digitalization limits innovation in terms of, because of the heavy resources requested by digitalization cases?
Well, I think that's a very good point, because I think, digitalization will not be the only key to success. I think digitalization helps us to be much faster. Digitalization can help us to understand people better and to deliver faster. So I think these are, the attributes of digitalization. At the same time, especially if you think about a food company like Bahlsene, a lot of the stuff that they develop now is still food. And digitalization only comes into the equation when it comes to logistics or communication or production. But the core product as such is not digital, but it's a factual analog product. So I think just looking at the impact of digital, digital is a means to an end, it's not the end. And I think some of the problems that are caused for organizations why they become so dysfunctional is because they think they should become digital, but they don't understand that digital is the means and not the end. So I think this is a very crucial point in terms of understanding how where we set the focus and where we set the focus right. And and if it's done the wrong way, you're absolutely right. So the pure focus on digitalization might kill and be not good.
Okay, thanks. So I see a couple of questions. One from Nadine. Which would you say are the leadership skills required to best support innovation?
Well, that's interesting, because I think, some of the most innovative companies, and this is more about culture and not just leadership, but I think it's a very good entry point, is if you look at most of the Silicon Valley companies that really scaled, and which now became the most valuable companies on earth, they have a very strange combination of being holocratic in terms of teams and agility, how they work on, on projects, but at the same time, they're run by dictators. Steve Jobs was a dictator. I think Bezos is a dictator. Elon Musk is a dictator. Lots of them are just dictators. Or call them kings, if you like. So they have a lot of authority. They really run the companies. They are the stars and icons. And if it comes to the running of the company, very agile, very holocratic. And I think, being able to combine these skills is essential. So I think the ones that are able to create a culture which allows semi-autonomy to take place, And this, Manfred Ketz-de-Vries, one of the godfathers of organizational psychology, wrote a lot about this. I think semi-autonomous organizations are extremely powerful and extremely strong because they give you some kind of framework and orientation. At the same time, they allow freedom, the freedom to create and freedom to develop something. So I think this is very, very important. I think, being clear about your values is very, very important. Being empathetic and understanding humans is very, very important. Being accessible is very, very important. We also saw, there's some, Manfred Ketz-de-Vries somehow at one point in time described something what he called the authentic organization, and he created 7 dimensions where a company could be good at, and then it's becoming a very strong, or can develop a very strong innovation culture. And actually, it applies to most of these skills are really leadership skills. So it's being open, being accessible, being transparent, walk the talk. It's like sometimes a very, very basic stuff. It's about being good communicators and create coherent experiences. And then this will help you to, to lead your company into the future. And then, enabling people help to create the better. And I think this is something which is very important because no leader alone or in its own right can change a company or create a better future, such out of one person. So I think this balance and also combining extremes is a very, very important skill.
Okay, well, I'm glad that it doesn't require to be a dictator then. Not necessarily.
A tiny degree of dictatorship is not a bad thing.
Okay, thank you. So we still have a couple of more questions. One question from Christian. Is digitalization inevitably leading to technological singularity, making humans redundant? If one's AI will also be able to be emotionally intelligent? Okay, that's a big jump in the future here.
Well, that's, to be honest, I think that's a very good question, and I think a lot of people really think about this. I think, what AI can do is help us be better humans, I hope. If we think about dictatorship, and if we think about, one of these, because, I think now organizations have become the most powerful force after nature. Nature still is the strongest force on earth, but after that, it's organizations. If organizations abuse power, and if they abuse the power of artificial intelligence, I think we will all be in a very bad position. I had the experience something like 2 or 3 years ago when I went to South by Southwest. I engaged into some kind of psychological testing by Watson, IBM's supercomputer, which was really, really interesting because the machine at one point in time engaged in a conversation with me, and the machine asked me, and trying to understand this psychologically, the machine asked me, you go through a park and you find a $10 note, what would you do, Mark? And I said, I thought, well, this is, who do you think I am? This is so fucking stupid, so I can deal with that. So I said, well, of course, I would take that $10 note, either leave it on the floor, for somebody who really needs it, I would take it, go back to the gate at the entrance and give it to the beggar who's there and who definitely needs it much more than I do. So Watson replied, how nice of you, Mark. If I had a heart, it would be warmed. And I think this was so interesting because suddenly I was falling in love with the machine, because the machine did something which was very unmachine-like, because it was ironic about the situation that it was a machine and it was joking around. So something which is very, very human. But again, if we understand that this was programmed initially by a human and is all learned on the structure of humans, I think we still have some kind of advantage, which is creative thinking and chaotic thinking, and making connections which a machine wouldn't make. Having said that, I don't know if you know the Go, this famous Go experiment by Google, when the machine first, I think the first step of machine learning was that the machine was the better chess player than the best chess playing human. But then the agent said, well, chess is so simplistic, they should try Go, because Go is so much more complex. And then a Google initiated machine won against the best Go player of all times. So basically, a machine can play, a machine can come up with algorithms that are much more interesting and, distinctive and even superior to human thinking. But I think if we still value, appreciate, and develop our humanistic traits, I think we will and should have a future. And this might be very romantic, but I do believe in this. And I think, creativity is a major ingredient in doing this, because still, and I don't know whether you're aware of the Frankenstein IO experiment, which was basically, trying to understand how, how bias is created in machine learning, because machines learn from, what they're fed with, and so they learned like gender bias, because, like the machine observed pictures of women, and then it connected women to their natural surrounding. And they found lots of kitchens and women were placed on the same picture. And they thought, oh, women and kitchen belong together. So the machine is learning from and the same applied to, colored people and, certain kind of, sports, for instance. So they thought, oh, colored, sport, this is the connection. So basically with the artifacts, how we feed machines and how algorithms learn, we create machines that have some kind of bias, which is human initiated. And I think this is also something that we have to understand and then see how we can evolve over time. But I hope that we have a future as humans.
Yeah, I hope so too, that we'll always have some kind of advantage to machines, at least with our creativity or something like that. So I think we might have just a couple of more minutes. We talked a lot about innovation, maybe some questions more relating to identity. So what would be the process of getting closer to identity? And is identity something which is specific for a special type of firms?
Oh, I think that's a beautiful question. I think the process of identity is really a process of understanding. So to be honest, it's a very therapeutic process, an anamnestic process, like the process that we go through when we go and see a medical doctor. So basically it's about speaking to people within the organization, or people that know the organization quite well and understand where they were coming from. Sometimes it might be the founders, sometimes it might be people that look after the archive. Sometimes it's just people who happen to be there for a very long time, and sometimes it's people who just joined, and they can, it's like in an MRT where you have multiple perspectives on the same object, and basically they make you understand how it all works. This is how we deconstruct identity. So it's very much like a psychodynamic therapeutic approach to understanding and exploring identity. Something what I really like, because it's so nice to understand where companies were coming from. And when we started, like this Bahlsene process, or even when we started to work with Henkel, or even with Springer, the German media publishing house, it's really interesting, what they tell you, and also how they talk about their very special personality traits, and also what their artifacts are, or what they value, what they celebrate. There's so many interesting perspectives on, how the company is developing and what's their narrative, like the church, who has a very special narrative. In terms of the companies, I think it applies to all kind of organizations, not only companies. It applies to the church, as for football clubs, as for small and medium-sized companies, as well as corporates. But I think the most, currently, the thing that I appreciate most are family-run, medium-sized businesses, because they really have a story to tell, and sometimes they also have somebody who's an icon, or who's a personification of that brand. And Mittelstand companies or medium-sized companies are also very interesting, because they, startups, they might, if they create impact, they go back and forth and pivot, and they develop new business model. If corporates want to change, it takes them so much time. If you want to change a medium-sized company, they just have to understand, and then somebody decides, and they turn around. And still, they're big enough to create value, and they create impact, because they already have a position on the market. So I think that's the perspective. So generally, there's no rule that applies to it. It's just useful to think about identity for a very small part of the market, but it's useful for all of them. But some are more stimulating to work with.
Yeah, and it's a bit easier than also for Mittelstand companies. if I understand correctly. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Mark, for all those valuable insights. I hope that all of you enjoyed the session and that you gained something for yourself, but also for your company. And we're very happy. If you want to know more, want to share further thoughts and feedback, reach out to us. And also for deeper insights, you can join our open program, Identity, Innovation, Impact, which will take place in February next year. So if you're interested in that, just reach out to us. Thank you very much for joining us today. Take care and have a lovely evening. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.